A police dog's impossible move saved her life. And it happened in seconds that nobody thought would matter. On a frozen lake where time seemed to stop, one German shepherd did something that defies every law of survival and logic. This is the story of an instinct so pure, so powerful, that it rewrote what we thought was possible. By the end, you'll understand why this rescue became the most talked about moment in one small town's history. And you'll never look at heroism the same way again. It was Saturday afternoon, and the world felt perfect. The kind of perfect that makes you let your guard down. The kind of perfect that tricks you into thinking nothing bad could possibly happen. Riverside Lake, nestled between snow-covered pine trees, had frozen solid 3 weeks earlier. The ice thick enough, strong enough, safe enough for families to venture out and experience that rare magic of winter skating. Emma Chen was 7 years old, and she had been counting down the days until this moment. Her parents, David and Susan, had promised her a day on the ice for weeks. Emma had practiced her skating in the driveway, mentally preparing herself, imagining the feeling of gliding across that pristine, frozen surface. She'd picked out her favorite pink jacket, the one with the white fur trim, and insisted on wearing it, even though her mother said she'd be too warm. Emma didn't care about being warm. She cared about looking like a real ice skater, like the ones she'd seen in videos online. The drive to Riverside Lake took 30 minutes from their house in the suburbs. Emma pressed her face against the car window the entire way, watching the landscape shift from houses and strip malls to open fields and forest. When they finally arrived, and she saw the lake stretching out before her, glittering under the pale winter sun, her breath caught in her throat. "It's so big," she whispered. David laughed from the driver's seat. "Biggest lake in the county, kiddo." They parked in the designated lot, already half full with other families who'd had the same idea. The air was crisp, almost sharp when Emma breathed it in. Her parents helped her put on her skates, and within minutes, she was standing on the ice for the first time in her life. Those first few steps were wobbly, uncertain. Emma gripped her mother's hand tightly, her ankles threatening to turn inward with every movement. But within 20 minutes, something clicked. Her body found its rhythm. Her confidence bloomed. And soon, she was gliding, really gliding, across the ice with her parents on either side of her, their hands ready to catch her if she fell, but increasingly unnecessary as Emma's natural balance took over. "You're doing it," Susan called out, her voice bright with pride. "You're really doing it, Emma." Emma's face was flushed with exertion and joy. This was the best day of her life. She was certain of it. Nothing could ruin this moment. Nothing could take this away from her. The Fahardame, designated skating area, was marked off with bright orange cones and signs warning people not to venture beyond the boundaries. The ice here was regularly checked, maintained, and deemed safe for public use. Families clustered in groups, children laughing, parents watching from the sidelines with thermoses of hot chocolate and warm smiles. Emma skated in circles around her parents, growing braver with each lap. She was moving faster now, her movements more fluid, more assured. She felt like she was flying. She felt invincible. "Don't go too far," David called out, but his tone was casual, relaxed. They weren't worried. Why would they be? The ice was solid. The day was perfect. Everything was fine. But Emma was 7, and 7-year-olds have a way of pushing boundaries, not out of defiance, but out of pure, unbridled curiosity and the intoxicating feeling of newfound ability. She skated faster. She skated further. Without consciously deciding to do so, she found herself moving toward the edge of the marked area, where the bright orange cones gave way to unmarked ice. The snow here was deeper, less trafficked. It looked different from the skating area, less transparent, more opaque. But to Emma, it just looked like more ice, more space to explore, more room to test her newfound skills. Her parents were still visible behind her, but they were getting smaller. Emma didn't think about this. She didn't think about the warnings on the signs. She didn't think about anything except the pure, simple joy of moving across the ice. The snow crunched beneath her skates as she ventured further from the designated area. And that's when she felt it. A subtle shift beneath her feet. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a slight give. A tiny softness in what should have been solid ice. Emma's brain registered it for only a fraction of a second before she pushed the sensation away. It was nothing. She was imagining things. The ice was fine. But it wasn't fine. Beneath the snow, the ice here was thinner. Much thinner. The lake's currents ran stronger near this section, and the cold hadn't penetrated as deeply. The ice was maybe 4 inches thick instead of the 12 inches that made up the skating area. It was still frozen, still solid, but only just barely. And it was waiting for the exact right amount of weight and pressure to give way. Emma provided that weight and pressure. She took one more stride, her skate blade cutting through the snow, and that's when the ice spoke. Not with a crack, not yet, but with a sound like a groan, like something shifting, like the earth itself was waking up and stretching. Emma's stomach lurched. For just a moment, she had time to think. Something's wrong. And then the ice beneath her right skate simply ceased to exist. The sensation was instantaneous and absolute. One moment, she was gliding. The next moment, she was falling. The ice didn't crack gradually. It shattered in a burst of white fragments, and Emma plunged downward, into darkness and cold beyond anything her 7-year-old mind could have imagined. The water hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't just cold. It was a living thing, a force that grabbed her entire body and squeezed. The shock was so complete, so overwhelming, that Emma's scream never made it out of her mouth. Instead, her lungs seized, her muscles locked, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but experience the absolute horror of submersion in near-freezing water. The ice above her head was still there. She could see it, a pale, distant ceiling of white and blue. But the hole she'd fallen through was already behind her, already lost in the murky darkness. The water was pulling her down, or maybe she was sinking. She couldn't tell which. The difference between up and down seemed to have vanished. Her pink jacket, the one she'd been so proud of, was already soaked, already heavy, already pulling her deeper. Emma's survival instinct finally kicked in. She thrashed, her small body convulsing in the water, her arms flailing upward toward the ice above. Her lungs were screaming now, demanding air, demanding oxygen, demanding something that wasn't available in this dark, cold, suffocating place. She kicked her legs, but her skates caught on something, maybe the edge of the hole, maybe just the water itself. And the resistance only terrified her more. "I'm going to die," a small voice whispered in her mind. "I'm going to die in the water." She pushed upward again, harder this time, desperation giving her strength she didn't know she had. Her hand broke the surface of the water, found the edge of the ice, and gripped it with all the strength in her small fingers. The ice was so cold it burned. She pulled herself upward, gasping, her mouth breaking the surface of the water. For one glorious second, she could breathe. She could see. She could feel the winter air on her face. But the ice around the hole was crumbling in her hands. Pieces of it broke off as she pulled, falling back into the water with soft splashes. The hole was bigger than she'd thought, or maybe it was growing. She couldn't tell. She couldn't think clearly. All she knew was that she needed to get out now. But the ice kept breaking, kept crumbling, kept refusing to support her weight. She pulled harder. Her fingers found a more solid section of ice, further from the hole's edge. She hauled herself upward, her soaking wet body heavy, her skates dragging through the water. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she might make it. She thought she might actually pull herself out of this nightmare and back onto the ice. But then her skates caught again, this time on the hole's edge, and she slipped backward. The water closed over her head. This time, there was no gasping, no moment of air. This time, there was only the cold and the dark and the absolute certainty that she was going to drown. On the shore, nobody had noticed yet. David and Susan were still watching the skating area, still sipping their hot chocolate, still smiling at the other families around them. Emma had been out of their direct line of sight for maybe 30 seconds. Just long enough for them not to notice that their daughter had vanished into a hole in the ice. But in those 30 seconds, everything had changed. And what nobody knew, what nobody could have possibly known, was that help was already on the lake. Not far away, not minutes away, but close enough to matter. Close enough to make the difference between a tragedy that would haunt a town forever and a miracle that would restore faith in the impossible. That help had 4 legs and a heart that beat for one purpose: to protect, to serve, and to save. And it was about to hear a scream that would change everything. Underwater, time stops meaning anything. Emma's lungs were on fire, not the kind of fire you experience when you hold your breath. This was different. This was primal. This was her body screaming at her in a language older than words, older than thought, older than civilization itself. You are drowning. You are going to die. Her eyes were open, but she couldn't see anything. The water was dark, murky, filled with particles of sediment and ice. It was like swimming through a cloud of black ink. She couldn't tell which direction was up. She couldn't tell which direction was down. She couldn't tell anything except that she was trapped in this cold, suffocating nightmare. And every second that passed was a second closer to the end. She thrashed again, her small body convulsing with panic and desperation. Her arms flailed in what she hoped was the direction of the surface. Her legs kicked, her skates still on her feet, still dragging, still catching on invisible obstacles. The pink jacket that she'd been so proud of was now a weight around her shoulders, soaked through and heavy, pulling her down like an anchor. Up, she thought, or tried to think. Find up. Get to up. But her brain was already starting to shut down. The cold was doing that to her. It was slowing her thoughts, making everything fuzzy and distant. She could feel her body getting heavier, her movements getting slower. The panic was still there, still screaming inside her chest, but it was becoming muted, like she was hearing it through water. Which, of course, she was. Her hand found something solid, ice. The underside of the frozen lake, smooth and slick and cold beyond comprehension. She pushed off from it, trying to propel herself upward, but the movement was weak, ineffectual. Her muscles weren't responding the way they should. The cold had infiltrated them, had made them sluggish and uncooperative. She needed air. She needed it more than she'd ever needed anything in her life. Her lungs were convulsing now, her body's survival instinct overriding her conscious mind's desperate plea not to breathe. The urge to inhale was becoming unbearable. It would be so Easy to just open her mouth and let the water in. It would be over. The burning would stop. The panic would stop. Everything would just stop. No. Some part of Emma, some small, stubborn 7-year-old part of her, refused to give in. She kicked harder. She clawed at the water with her hands, trying to pull herself upward through sheer force of will. Her fingers found the ice again, found the rough edges where it had cracked and broken. She pulled, her head broke the surface. For one glorious, terrible second, she gasped. Water poured from her mouth and nose. Her lungs seized as they tried to process air mixed with lake water. She coughed, gagged, choked. But she was breathing. She was alive. She was... The ice crumbled beneath her hands. Emma fell backward into the water again, her moment of hope extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. But this time, she'd seen something. In that brief second when her head was above water, she'd seen the hole. She'd seen the ice surrounding it. She'd seen the shore in the distance, impossibly far away. She'd seen that she was alone. Her parents weren't there. No one was coming to help her. There was just the water and the cold and the ice that kept breaking every time she tried to grab it. The panic returned. But it was different now. It was deeper, darker, more absolute. This wasn't just the panic of being cold and wet. This was the panic of understanding, on some primal level, that she might not survive this. That the world she'd known, her parents, her house, her school, her life, might be ending right here, right now, in this dark water under the ice. She tried to scream, but the water filled her mouth. She tried to call for help, but there was no one to hear her. She tried to climb out, but the ice kept breaking. Time became meaningless. Was she down there for 10 seconds? A minute? An hour? It felt like forever. It felt like she'd always been drowning, like this was all she'd ever known, like the world above the ice was just a dream she'd made up. Her movements were getting slower now, not because she was giving up, but because her body was shutting down. The cold was doing that. It was stealing her strength, stealing her heat, stealing her will to fight. Hypothermia was setting in, and it was whispering to her in a voice that was almost gentle. Just stop fighting. Just let go. It will be easier. Emma's eyes were getting heavy. Her lungs had stopped burning. Everything was becoming numb, becoming distant, becoming... Wait. Something was happening above the ice. Emma's fading consciousness registered movement, vibrations in the water. Something large was moving up there, on the surface. Something was happening. Someone was... But her vision was already fading. The darkness was closing in from the edges, pulling her under, pulling her down, pulling her away from the light and the air and the world above. She had maybe 30 seconds left. On the shore, the screams had started. Susan Chen's voice cut through the winter air like a knife, high and sharp and absolutely terrified. She'd been watching the skating area, watching the other families, when she noticed that Emma wasn't there anymore. For a moment, she'd thought maybe Emma had skated past them, maybe was on the other side of the designated area. But then she'd seen the hole in the ice. At first, her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. A hole in the ice, where Emma had been skating just moments before. And then, with the force of a physical blow, the realization hit her. Emma fell in. "Emma!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "David! Emma fell in!" David's head snapped around. For a moment, he didn't understand what Susan was saying. And then he saw the hole, saw the broken ice, saw the absence of his daughter, and his entire world collapsed. He started running, but he'd only made it a few steps before he realized the terrible truth. He couldn't reach her, not in time. The ice near the hole was too unstable. If he tried to walk on it, he'd fall through too. And then there would be 2 people drowning instead of 1. "Help!" Susan was screaming now, her voice raw with panic. "Someone help! My daughter! My daughter is in the water!" Other people were turning now. Other families were noticing. Other skaters were stopping and staring. Someone called 911. Someone else was shouting instructions that no one was following because no one knew what to do. There was no rope nearby. There was no rescue equipment. There was just a hole in the ice and a little girl drowning beneath it, and absolutely nothing anyone could do to save her. The screams were getting louder, more desperate, more anguished. And that's when the police car arrived. Officer James Mitchell had been parked about a quarter-mile away, in a small overlook that gave him a view of the lake and the surrounding area. He was on routine patrol, the kind of Saturday afternoon patrol where nothing ever happened, where he mostly just sat in his car and watched the families enjoying the winter weather. He'd been thinking about grabbing lunch when he heard the screams. At first, he thought maybe it was kids playing. Maybe someone had fallen and scraped their knee. But then he heard the tone of the screams, the absolute terror in them, and something in his chest went cold. He started the engine. Kaiser, his K9 partner, was in the back of the car, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of dark mahogany and eyes that missed nothing. Kaiser had been napping, but he came alert instantly when James shifted into gear. The dog's ears perked up, his body tensed. He could sense his handler's urgency, could feel the sudden spike in adrenaline that James was trying to suppress. James drove toward the screams, his tires crunching on the snow-packed parking lot. He could see the crowd now, could see people pointing at the lake, could see the hole in the ice from a distance. His mind was already running through the possibilities, running through the protocols, running through the terrible mathematics of water temperature and survival time. A child in 40-degree water. Maximum survival time, 15 to 30 minutes. But that was if they were conscious and fighting. If they were panicking, if they were thrashing, if they were burning through their oxygen reserves in terror, the time could be cut in half. James pulled into the parking lot and was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He could see a woman on the shore, the mother, he assumed, screaming her daughter's name over and over again. He could see a man pacing back and forth, his hands in his hair, looking helpless and terrified. And he could see the hole in the ice. "How long?" he shouted at the mother as he ran toward the shore. "I don't know. A minute, maybe 2. Susan was sobbing now, her entire body shaking. "She fell through. She went under. I can't see her. I can't see her." James's mind was already calculating. 1 to 2 minutes. The child was still underwater, still drowning, still running out of time. He looked at the hole, at the broken ice surrounding it, at the distance between where he was standing and where the child had gone down. The ice was too unstable. He couldn't walk on it. A rescue rope wouldn't work. The child was underwater, unconscious probably, unable to grab onto anything. There was only one option. James ran back to his car and opened the rear door. Kaiser jumped out immediately, his body language shifting from alert to ready. He knew this stance. He knew what it meant when James moved like this, when his handler's entire being was focused on a single purpose. "Find her," James said, pointing toward the lake. "Find her, Kaiser. Go." And Kaiser went. The German shepherd launched himself across the snow and onto the ice, his powerful legs driving him forward at full speed. His paws hit the frozen surface with a sound like gunshots, and the ice cracked beneath him with each stride. James watched, his heart in his throat, knowing that he was sending his partner into an impossible situation. knowing that the ice could give way at any moment, knowing that he might be sending Kaiser to his death. But he also knew that it was the only chance the girl had. Kaiser was moving fast now, his dark coat a blur against the white ice. The crowd on the shore had gone silent, all eyes on the dog. All hope, however fragile, was pinned on this one animal. The hole was getting closer. James could see it now. The jagged edges of broken ice, the dark water beneath, the absolute emptiness where a child had disappeared. Kaiser was maybe 30 feet away. Maybe 20, maybe. The ice cracked beneath the dog's front paws. For a moment, James thought it was over. He thought Kaiser was going to fall through, thought the rescue was going to become a double tragedy. But Kaiser's instincts were sharper than human calculation. The dog adjusted his weight, changed his gait, distributed his mass differently across the ice, and he kept running. 15 feet from the hole now. 10. 5. Kaiser reached the edge of the hole and did something that James had never trained him to do, something that no training protocol had ever covered. The dog lay flat on his belly, spreading his weight across the unstable ice, and began to slide himself toward the hole, his body becoming a bridge between the solid ice and the dark water below. The ice groaned beneath him. It was cracking, splintering, threatening to give way. But Kaiser didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate the odds or consider the danger. He just kept moving forward, driven by something deeper than training, something more primal than logic. He reached the edge of the hole, and beneath the water, in the last moments before darkness claimed her completely, Emma's eyes opened. Emma's eyes opened, but she couldn't see anything. Not darkness. That would have implied light somewhere, a reference point, a direction. This was something else entirely. This was the absence of everything. The void, the space between consciousness and death where neither existed fully, where the mind floated in a state of suspension that was neither living nor dying, neither aware nor asleep. She was drowning. That much her body knew, even if her mind couldn't quite grasp it. Every cell in her small frame was screaming, was burning, was demanding oxygen that wasn't coming. Her lungs had long since given up their frantic attempts to breathe. Her heart was still beating, but slowly now, weakly, like a drum being played by hands that were growing tired. She had maybe seconds left. But in those last seconds, something changed. A shape appeared above her in the murky water. Not clear, not distinct, just a shadow. A form, something large and dark that was moving toward her with purpose. Emma's fading consciousness registered it without understanding it. A hallucination, maybe. A dream. A final gift from her dying brain, conjuring comfort in her last moments. But it wasn't a hallucination. Kaiser's powerful jaws closed around Emma's jacket, not her body, not her neck, but the fabric of that pink coat she'd been so proud of. The dog's teeth found purchase in the material, and his massive neck muscles contracted with a force that had been honed through years of training and instinct. He pulled. The movement was sudden and violent. Emma's limp body jerked upward through the water, her arms and legs trailing behind her like a doll's. The dog was pulling her toward the surface, toward the light, toward the air that her lungs were screaming for. Above the ice, James was watching with every fiber of his being focused on his partner. Kaiser's head was still visible, the dog's jaws clamped around the pink fabric of Emma's jacket. The ice around the hole was cracking more dramatically now, splintering under the stress of the dog's movements and the weight he was supporting. "Come on," James whispered, though he didn't know if he was talking to Kaiser or to the universe or to God or to anyone who might be listening. "Come on, come on, come on." Kaiser's back legs were scrambling now, finding purchase on the fractured ice, driving the dog backward with every ounce of strength he possessed. His muscles were burning. The cold was already seeping into his coat, already beginning its slow work of stealing his body heat. But the dog didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He didn't consider the danger or calculate the odds. He just pulled. Emma's head broke the surface of the water. For a moment, nothing happened. Her body was limp, unresponsive. There was no gasp, no cough, no sign of life. She was pale, her lips already taking on a bluish tint. Her eyes were open but unseeing. But Kaiser didn't stop pulling. The dog was backing away from the hole now, his powerful legs driving him backward across the cracking ice. His jaws never loosened their grip on the pink jacket. His body never wavered from its singular purpose: get the child to safety. Get her away from the water. Get her to where her people could help her. The ice groaned and cracked beneath Kaiser's weight, but it held. 5 feet from the hole, 10 feet, 15 feet. Kaiser was pulling Emma's entire body out of the water now, her soaking wet form sliding across the ice behind him. Her skates were still on her feet, still catching slightly on the ice. But Kaiser's strength was more than enough to overcome the resistance. On the shore, Susan saw her daughter's head emerge from the water. The scream that tore from her throat was something between hope and terror, between joy and despair. She didn't know if Emma was alive. She couldn't tell from this distance, but she could see that her daughter was out of the water. And that was something. That was everything. "Emma!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Emma!" Kaiser reached the edge of the designated skating area, the ice that was thick and solid and safe. He released his grip on Emma's jacket and immediately began backing away, his body language suddenly changing from rescue to caution. The dog knew, on some instinctive level, that his job was done, that the humans would take it from here. James was already running. He'd been moving the moment he saw Kaiser's head break the surface, had been sprinting toward the hole even as the dog was pulling Emma to safety. Now he was on the ice, his feet moving as fast as they could carry him, his eyes fixed on his daughter, on the child who had somehow, impossibly, been saved. He reached Emma in seconds that felt like hours. She was lying on her back on the ice, her body completely still, her chest not moving. James's training kicked in. He knew CPR. He'd been certified for years. But knowing CPR and performing it on a 7-year-old child who'd been submerged in freezing water were two very different things. He checked for a pulse. For a moment, a terrible, endless moment, he couldn't find one. And then, there it was. Faint, slow, but there. She had a heartbeat. She was alive. But she wasn't breathing. "Come on," James said, his voice steady despite the terror screaming inside him. "Come on, Emma, come on." He tilted her head back, opened her airway, and began rescue breathing. 1 breath, 2 breaths. He watched her chest rise with each breath he forced into her lungs. He watched for any sign of response, any indication that her body was fighting back, that her will to live was stronger than the cold that had invaded her. Nothing. He moved into chest compressions, his hands pressing down on her small chest with a force that had to be strong enough to restart her heart, but gentle enough not to break her ribs. 1 compression, 2, 3. He was counting in his head, following the rhythm that had been drilled into him through years of training. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Repeat. The crowd on the shore had gone completely silent. Even Susan had stopped screaming. All anyone could do was watch as a police officer performed CPR on a small child, while a German shepherd sat nearby, his dark eyes never leaving the girl, his body language tense with a worry that transcended species. Kaiser knew something was wrong. The dog had done his job. He'd pulled the girl from the water. But she wasn't moving. She wasn't responding. And in the dog's mind, in the part of him that was driven by instinct and training and an almost supernatural connection to the people he loved, something was still not right. James continued the compressions. 30, 29, 28. His hands were moving in a rhythm that was almost meditative, almost hypnotic. Push, release, push, release. He wasn't thinking about whether it was working. He wasn't thinking about the odds or the statistics or the grim reality that the longer a child stayed submerged, the less likely they were to survive. He was just doing the work. 2 more breaths. Her chest rose with each one. Her lips were still blue. Her skin was the color of marble. But James kept going. He kept pushing. He kept breathing for her because her own lungs had forgotten how. In the distance, he could hear sirens. The ambulance was coming. The paramedics were on their way. But James knew that every second counted, that every compression might be the one that made the difference, that his hands might be the only thing standing between Emma Chen and death. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Repeat. How long had he been doing this? A minute? 2 minutes? Time had lost all meaning. There was only the rhythm, only the work, only the desperate hope that somewhere inside this small, cold, seemingly lifeless body, a spark of life was still burning. And then, Emma's body convulsed. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was there. A spasm, a response, a sign that something inside her was still fighting. James paused, watching, hoping, praying. And Emma coughed. It was a terrible sound, wet and ragged and desperate. Water poured from her mouth and nose. Her entire small body convulsed as her lungs rejected the lake water that had invaded them. Her back arched, her head turned to the side, and she gasped. It was the most beautiful sound James had ever heard. That desperate, ragged gasp as Emma's lungs found air again, as her body remembered how to breathe, as the spark of life inside her flared back into being. She was alive. On the shore, Susan's scream was different now. Not a scream of terror, but a scream of pure, unbridled joy. David was running toward the ice, his arms outstretched, his face streaming with tears. Emma's eyes were still closed, but her body was responding now. She was coughing, gasping, her small chest heaving as she fought to expel the water from her lungs and draw in oxygen to replace it. Her skin was still pale, still tinged with blue, but there was color returning to her lips, life returning to her body. Kaiser moved closer, his nose touching Emma's face gently, his dark eyes never leaving the child who he'd pulled from the water. The dog's entire body was shaking, from cold, from exertion, from the intensity of what he'd just done. But his focus never wavered. He stayed by Emma's side, a silent guardian, a 4-legged angel who had done the impossible. The ambulance arrived moments later, its lights flashing, its sirens wailing. The paramedics rushed out with equipment and expertise and the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of emergency response. They took over from James, taking Emma's vital signs, starting an IV, wrapping her in emergency blankets, preparing her for transport to the hospital. But even as they worked, even as they moved her onto a stretcher and began loading her into the ambulance, Emma's small hand reached out. She was looking for something, looking for someone. And her eyes found Kaiser. The dog was standing nearby, shaking with cold, his dark coat dripping with lake water. But his eyes were on Emma, and Emma's eyes were on him. For a moment, across the space between them, There was an understanding that transcended words, that transcended species, that transcended the normal boundaries of the world. They had survived together. They had faced death together. And they had won. Emma's lips moved, forming a word that was barely audible. Dog. It was the first word she'd spoken since falling into the water. It wasn't mom or dad or help or water. It was dog. It was an acknowledgement, a gratitude, a recognition of the impossible thing that had just happened. One of the paramedics picked up on it and gently guided Emma's stretcher toward Kaiser. The dog stepped closer, and Emma's small hand reached out and touched his nose. For a moment, they stayed like that. The child and the dog, connected by something that no one else could quite understand. Then the paramedics were moving again, loading Emma into the ambulance, preparing for the drive to the hospital. Susan and David were being ushered toward the ambulance as well, their faces a mixture of relief and shock and the kind of gratitude that comes from being given back something you thought you'd lost forever. James stood on the shore, watching them go, his entire body beginning to shake now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Kaiser came to his side, and James wrapped his arm around his partner, pulling the wet dog close. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Good boy, Kaiser. Good boy." The dog leaned against his handler, and together they watched the ambulance disappear down the road, its lights flashing, carrying a small girl who had drowned and come back, who had died and been resurrected, who had been saved by an impossible act of courage and love. The lake behind them was still and silent, its surface unmarred except for the hole where a child had fallen through. The hole where a miracle had happened. The hole that would forever mark the place where the impossible became possible, where a dog and a girl had danced with death and emerged victorious. The winter sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. And as the light faded, as the day turned toward evening, one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear. Emma Chen lay in the pediatric intensive care unit, surrounded by machines that beeped and hissed and monitored every aspect of her small body's fight for survival. An oxygen mask covered the lower half of her face. IV lines ran from her arms to bags of fluid hanging from metal stands. Her chest rose and fell with the help of careful, measured breaths that were being assisted by the machines around her. She was alive, but barely. The doctors had explained it to Susan and David in terms that were both technical and terrifying. Severe hypothermia, water in her lungs, lack of oxygen to the brain for an extended period. Aspiration pneumonia, a very real risk given that she'd inhaled lake water. The fact that she'd been revived at all was, in the doctor's professional opinion, a miracle. The fact that she might survive was uncertain. The fact that she might survive without permanent brain damage was even more uncertain. "We won't know the full extent of any neurological damage until she wakes up," Dr. Patricia Okonkwo had said, her voice gentle but honest. She was Emma's primary physician, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had delivered both good news and bad news too many times to count. The lack of oxygen to her brain during the submersion is a serious concern. We're keeping her sedated to allow her body to focus on healing rather than fighting the machines that are helping her breathe. "When will she wake up?" Susan had asked, her voice small and fragile, like it might break if she pushed too hard. "We're not sure," Dr. Okonkwo had replied. "Could be hours, could be days. We'll gradually reduce the sedation and see how she responds." That had been 6 hours ago. Now Susan sat in a chair beside Emma's bed, holding her daughter's small, cold hand. She hadn't left the room. She hadn't slept. She'd barely moved except to use the bathroom and to accept the cups of coffee that David kept bringing her. She just sat there, watching her daughter breathe, watching the machines that were doing the breathing for her, watching for any sign of consciousness, any indication that Emma was still in there somewhere, still fighting, still coming back. David was in the waiting room, making phone calls. He'd called his parents. He'd called Susan's parents. He'd called their extended family, their friends, their neighbors. By now, the story had probably spread through their entire community. A 7-year-old girl had fallen through the ice. A police dog had saved her. A miracle had occurred at Riverside Lake. But miracles, Susan was learning, came with a terrible price. She squeezed Emma's hand gently. "Come back to me, baby," she whispered. "Come back to me. Please come back to me." Emma's hand didn't squeeze back. Her eyes didn't flutter. Her body remained still, suspended in the state between life and death that the machines were holding her in. The only sign that she was alive at all was the rise and fall of her chest, the steady beeping of the heart monitor, the occasional alarm when one of the machines detected something that needed adjustment. In the waiting room, David sat with his phone in his lap, staring at the wall. He'd made all the calls he could make. He'd answered all the questions people had asked. He'd accepted all the prayers and well wishes and offers of support. And now he was left with nothing to do but wait and hope and try not to think about all the ways this could still end badly. A nurse came by, a young woman named Michelle, who had been kind and professional and seemed to genuinely care about Emma's well-being. "Your wife should eat something," she said gently. "She hasn't had anything since she got here." David nodded. "I'll try to convince her. She won't leave Emma's side." "I understand," Michelle said. "But she needs to take care of herself too. If Emma wakes up, she's going to need her mother to be strong." It was a gentle reminder, delivered with kindness, but with the underlying message. Your daughter might wake up. You need to be ready for that. David went back to Emma's room and convinced Susan to eat a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria. She did it mechanically, without tasting it, without really being aware of what she was doing. Her mind was entirely focused on Emma, on the machines around her, on the steady beeping that was the only proof that her daughter was still alive. Hours passed. The sun set outside the hospital windows. The visiting hours ended, and David had to leave, though not before kissing Emma on the forehead and whispering something that only she could hear. Susan stayed. She always stayed. She would stay until Emma woke up, or until the doctors told her there was no point in staying anymore. She hoped it would be the former. Around midnight, Emma's body moved. It was a small movement, a slight twitch of her fingers, a barely perceptible shift in her position. Susan's eyes snapped open. She'd been dozing in the chair, her hand still holding Emma's, and now she was suddenly, completely awake. "Emma," she whispered. "Baby? Can you hear me?" There was no response. The machines continued their steady beeping. Emma's eyes remained closed. But something had changed. Something was different. Susan pressed the call button. Michelle arrived within minutes. She checked Emma's vital signs, looked at the monitors, made notes on her chart. "Her body is starting to wake up," she explained. "The sedation is wearing off naturally. She might be coming around soon." "Should I call my husband?" Susan asked. "You could," Michelle said, "but it might still be a while. Try to get some rest. I'll let you know if anything changes." But Susan couldn't rest. She was too alert now, too aware that something was happening, that Emma was beginning her journey back from wherever she'd been. She sat in the chair and watched her daughter's face, looking for any sign of consciousness, any indication that the girl she loved was returning to her. At 2:47 a.m., Emma's eyes moved beneath her closed eyelids. REM sleep. Rapid eye movement. It meant her brain was active, was processing, was working. Susan leaned forward, her heart beginning to race. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "Come back to me. I'm right here. I'm right here with you." Emma's eyes opened. For a moment they were unfocused, unseeing. Her pupils were dilated, her gaze distant. She was looking at something, but not at anything in the room. She was looking at something internal, something that only she could see. Then, slowly, her eyes began to focus. They moved, tracking across the ceiling, across the machines, across the room. And finally, they found Susan's face. For a long moment, there was no recognition. Emma's eyes were open, but she wasn't really seeing her mother. She was still caught somewhere between sleep and waking, between the world of dreams and the world of reality. And then something shifted. Emma's eyes widened slightly. Her pupils contracted, and recognition bloomed across her small face. Not complete recognition, not full understanding, but the beginning of awareness that this face, this woman, this presence was familiar, was safe, was home. "Mommy?" The word was barely audible, muffled by the oxygen mask, but it was there. It was real. It was the most beautiful sound Susan had ever heard. "I'm here, baby," Susan said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm right here. You're safe. You're in the hospital. You're safe." Emma's eyes moved around the room again, taking in the machines, the monitors, the IV lines running from her arms. Her small face scrunched up in confusion and fear. She tried to move, tried to sit up, and the machines around her immediately began to alarm. "It's okay," Susan said, pressing the call button again. "It's okay, Emma. You need to stay still. You're hooked up to machines that are helping you breathe." "Water," Emma whispered, her voice raspy and weak. "I was in the water." "I know, baby," Susan said, tears streaming down her face. "I know. But you're safe now. You're out of the water. You're in the hospital and the doctors are taking care of you." Michelle rushed in, followed quickly by Dr. Okonkwo. They moved efficiently, checking Emma's vital signs, adjusting the machines, assessing her level of consciousness and awareness. Emma's eyes tracked them as they moved, fear evident in her expression. "Emma, can you hear me?" Dr. Okonkwo asked gently. "My name is Dr. Okonkwo. You're in the hospital. You fell into the lake, and we brought you here to make sure you're okay. Do you understand?" Emma nodded slowly, her eyes still wide with fear and confusion. "You're going to be fine," Dr. Okonkwo continued. "The machine you're connected to is helping you breathe. We're going to gradually reduce the oxygen it's giving you, and we're going to see how your lungs do on their own. Okay?" Emma nodded again. Over the next hour, the doctors ran a series of tests. They checked her reflexes, her responsiveness, her ability to follow commands. They asked her questions. "What's your name? How old are you? What's your mother's name? Do you remember falling into the water?" Emma answered them all, her voice getting stronger with each response. The answers were correct. Her cognition seemed intact. There was no obvious sign of permanent brain damage, though Dr. Okonkwo cautioned that it was still early, that more extensive testing would be needed to rule out any subtle neurological effects. "The fact that she's conscious and responsive is an excellent sign," Dr. Okonkwo said to Susan and David, who had rushed back to the hospital the moment Susan called him. "The next 48 hours will be critical. We need to monitor her for any signs of secondary drowning or aspiration pneumonia. But I'm cautiously optimistic." cautiously optimistic. It wasn't the same as saying Emma would be fine, but it was better than the alternative. It was hope, fragile and precious and terrifying in its uncertainty. Emma drifted in and out of sleep over the next several hours, her body exhausted from the ordeal it had endured. Each time she woke, Susan was there, holding her hand, whispering reassurances. Each time she slept, Susan watched over her, monitoring her breathing, watching the machines, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in, that her daughter would be okay. As dawn broke over the hospital, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emma woke again. This time, she was more alert, more aware. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a kind of bewildered curiosity. "Mommy?" she said, her voice still raspy but stronger than before. There was a dog. A big dog. He was in the water with me. Susan's heart clenched. She'd been so focused on Emma's physical survival that she'd almost forgotten about Kaiser, about the dog who had made all of this possible. "Yes, baby," she said. "There was a dog. A very special dog named Kaiser. He saved your life." "I want to see him," Emma said, her eyes beginning to close again as exhaustion pulled her back towards sleep. "I want to see the dog." "Maybe soon," Susan whispered. "Maybe very soon." And as Emma drifted back into sleep, Susan made a silent promise to herself and to the universe and to the dog who had given her back her daughter. Somehow, some way, Emma and Kaiser would be reunited. They had survived something impossible together. They deserved to see each other again. In a police station across town, Kaiser lay on his bed in the K9 unit, his dark coat still damp from the lake water. James had given him a thorough bath and a warm blanket. But the dog was still shaking slightly, still recovering from the cold and the exertion. James sat beside his partner, his hand resting on the dog's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You did good today, boy," he said quietly. "You did something incredible today." Kaiser's tail thumped weakly against the bed, a small acknowledgement of his handler's words. Neither of them knew yet that Emma was awake. Neither of them knew that the girl was asking for the dog, that she wanted to see him again, that the bond forged in those terrible moments in the freezing water was strong enough to transcend the boundaries of species and circumstance. But they would find out soon enough. And when they did, the story of what had happened at Riverside Lake would shift from a story about survival into a story about connection, about the impossible bonds that could form between humans and animals, about the way that love and loyalty could transcend even the most terrifying circumstances. The real miracle, it would turn out, wasn't just that Emma had survived. It was that she and Kaiser had found each other, and in finding each other, had discovered something that neither of them would ever forget. The hospital room felt smaller when there were visitors. By the third day after Emma's rescue, word had spread throughout the community about the miraculous survival of the 7-year-old girl and the heroic actions of the police dog who had saved her. Local news stations had picked up the story. Social media had exploded with posts and shares and comments from people who had been moved by the tale of a child pulled back from the brink of death by an animal who asked for nothing in return except to do what he was trained to do. Flowers filled every available surface in Emma's hospital room. Balloons with messages of hope and encouragement clustered near the ceiling. Cards from strangers lined the windowsill. People who had never met Emma but felt compelled to reach out, to acknowledge the miracle, to be part of something larger than themselves. Emma sat up in bed now, the oxygen mask gone, replaced by a simple nasal cannula that delivered oxygen directly to her nose. Her color had returned. Her voice had regained its strength. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that she would make a full recovery, though they wanted to keep her for observation for at least another week to monitor for any signs of complications. But Emma wasn't thinking about complications. She was thinking about the dog. "When can I see Kaiser?" she asked for what felt like the 100th time that day. "Mom, when can I see the dog?" Susan exchanged a glance with David, who was sitting in the chair by the window. They'd been trying to arrange a visit from Officer James Mitchell and his K-9 partner for the past 2 days. But the hospital had strict policies about animals in patient rooms. Even police dogs. Even dogs that had saved lives. "We're working on it, sweetie," Susan said, smoothing Emma's hair back from her forehead. "Officer Mitchell is trying to get permission. The hospital is being a little difficult about it, but we're not giving up." Emma's face fell slightly, but she nodded. She understood in the way that children understood things, not completely, not fully, but enough to know that adults were trying and that sometimes trying wasn't enough. That afternoon, a woman in a hospital administrator's uniform came to Emma's room. Her name was Margaret Torres, and she had kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had learned to navigate bureaucracy while still maintaining her humanity. "I hear there's a very special dog who wants to visit a very special girl," she said, smiling at Emma. Emma's eyes widened. "Kaiser? Kaiser is coming?" "We're going to make it happen," Margaret said. "But we need to do this carefully. The dog will need to be on a leash at all times. He can't jump on the bed or disturb any of the medical equipment. And we'll need to keep the visit short, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Do you think you can follow those rules?" Emma nodded so enthusiastically that her nasal cannula nearly slipped off. Yes, I can follow the rules. When can he come?" "How about this evening?" Margaret asked. "Around 6 o'clock? Officer Mitchell said he could bring Kaiser by after his shift." Emma's face lit up like a Christmas tree. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of barely contained excitement, alternating between talking about how much she missed Kaiser and asking 1,000 questions about what would happen when he arrived. Susan tried to manage her daughter's expectations. "He might not remember you, honey. It's only been a few days, but dogs don't always remember things the way people do." But Emma was undeterred. "He'll remember," she said with absolute certainty. "He saved me. I saved him too. We're connected." At 5:55 p.m., there was a knock on the hospital room door. Officer James Mitchell stood in the doorway, still in his uniform, looking slightly uncomfortable in the hospital setting. And beside him, on a leash, was Kaiser. The German shepherd's dark coat gleamed under the fluorescent hospital lights. His ears were alert, his eyes intelligent and focused. He'd been given a bath since the incident at the lake, and he looked almost regal, like a warrior returning from battle. But the moment his eyes found Emma, something shifted in the dog's expression. His ears perked up even more, his tail began to wag, and he pulled forward on the leash, straining toward the bed where the small girl lay. "Easy, boy," James said gently, keeping the leash taut. "Easy. We need to be careful." But Kaiser wasn't interested in being careful. He was interested in the girl he'd pulled from the water, the girl whose life he'd saved, the girl who, in those terrifying moments beneath the ice, had become more important to him than his own survival. James guided Kaiser slowly to the side of the bed, keeping the dog's front paws on the floor. Kaiser's entire body was trembling with excitement, his tail wagging so hard that his entire rear end was moving back and forth. Emma reached out her hand, the one that didn't have an IV line. and let Kaiser sniff her fingers. The moment the dog's nose touched her hand, Emma's face transformed. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, tears of recognition and relief, and the kind of joy that only comes from being reunited with someone you thought you might never see again. "Kaiser," she whispered, "you came back. You came back to me." Kaiser's tongue licked her fingers, her palm, her wrist. He was making soft whining sounds in the back of his throat, sounds that expressed emotions that had no human equivalent. Joy, relief, love, recognition. "He remembers you," James said quietly, his own eyes glistening slightly. "I've never seen him act like this before. It's like he knows." Emma reached down and buried her face in Kaiser's fur, careful not to disturb her IV line or the nasal cannula. The dog pressed his head against her, his entire body vibrating with the intensity of his emotion. "Thank you," Emma whispered into Kaiser's coat. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for not letting me die." Susan was crying now, watching the reunion between her daughter and the dog who had given her back to her. David had his arm around his wife, and he was crying too. Even James, standing beside his partner, had tears streaming down his face. For 15 minutes, they stayed like that. Emma and Kaiser, connected by something that transcended words, that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal. The dog rested his head on the edge of Emma's bed. The girl stroked his ears, his neck, his back. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to do anything except be present with each other, acknowledging what they had survived together. When the time came for Kaiser to leave, Emma's face crumpled. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "No. He has to stay. He can't leave. He has to go home with Officer Mitchell," Susan explained gently. "But you can see him again. As soon as you get out of the hospital, we'll arrange for you to see him." "Promise?" Emma asked, looking at James. James knelt down so he was at eye level with Emma. "I promise," he said. "Kaiser and I will be waiting for you. Whenever you're ready." Kaiser licked Emma's face one more time, and then James gently pulled him away from the bed. The dog went reluctantly, his eyes never leaving Emma as James guided him toward the door. At the threshold, Kaiser paused and looked back. Emma raised her hand in a wave, and Kaiser's tail wagged one more time before James led him out of the room. After they were gone, Emma lay back against her pillows, exhausted but smiling. The flowers and balloons and cards from strangers suddenly seemed less important. The machines monitoring her vital signs seemed less intrusive. The hospital room seemed less like a prison and more like a place of healing. Because she had seen Kaiser again, and Kaiser had remembered her. And that meant everything. Over the next 5 days, Emma's recovery accelerated. The doctors ran more tests and found no signs of permanent brain damage. Her lungs were healing well. The risk of aspiration pneumonia had passed. By the end of the week, Dr. Okonkwo gave the okay for Emma to be discharged. "She's a lucky girl," Dr. Okonkwo said to Susan and David as they prepared to leave the hospital. The fact that Officer Mitchell was so close, the fact that Kaiser was able to reach her, the fact that CPR was started so quickly. Any one of those things could have gone differently, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. But everything aligned perfectly. It's truly a miracle. The drive home from the hospital felt surreal. Emma sat in the back seat, looking out the window at the world that had continued on without her, that had moved forward while she was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. She felt different. They stopped at the police station before going home. James had arranged for them to come by, and when they arrived, Kaiser was waiting in the K9 unit. The moment he saw Emma, he was on his feet, his entire body quivering with excitement. This time, there were no hospital protocols to follow. This time, Emma could hug the dog properly, could wrap her arms around his neck and bury her face in his fur without worrying about IV lines or nasal cannulas or disturbing medical equipment. Kaiser's tail wagged so hard that his entire body moved. He licked Emma's face, her ears, her neck. He pressed his body against hers, and for a moment, it was like they were back in the water together, fighting against the cold and the dark, fighting for survival, fighting for each other. "You're my hero," Emma whispered into Kaiser's fur. "You're my best friend." Kaiser whined softly, a sound that seemed to acknowledge the truth in her words. James stood nearby, watching the reunion, his expression unreadable, but his eyes bright with emotion. Officer Mitchell had seen a lot in his years of police work. He'd seen the worst of humanity and some of the best, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. The bond between a child and a dog, forged in the most terrifying circumstances imaginable, strong enough to transcend fear and cold and the very real possibility of death. "I want to adopt him," Emma said suddenly, looking up at James. "Can I adopt Kaiser? Can he be my dog?" Susan started to say something, but James held up a hand. "Kaiser is a working police dog," he explained gently. "He has a job. He has to help other people the way he helped you. But..." He paused, considering. "Maybe we could work something out. Maybe Kaiser could visit you sometimes. And maybe you could visit him at the station. Would that be okay?" Emma nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with the arrangement. But she understood, in the way that children understood things, that Kaiser had a purpose beyond being her pet. That he had saved her because he was trained to save people, and that training meant he had to be available to save others too. Over the following weeks, Emma and Kaiser became regulars at the police station. Emma would go after school, and Kaiser would greet her with the same unbridled enthusiasm every single time, as if it had been months since they'd last seen each other instead of just a day or two. The story of Emma's rescue made the local news again, this time not as a breaking news story, but as a feel-good human interest piece. The reporter who covered it interviewed Emma and James, and even managed to get some good footage of Emma and Kaiser playing together in the police station's training yard. The video went viral. Within a week, it had been viewed millions of times. People from all over the country, all over the world, were sharing the story of the 7-year-old girl and the police dog who had saved her life. Emma received letters from children in other countries, from adults who had been moved by her story, from people who wanted to know more about Kaiser and James and the miracle that had occurred at Riverside Lake. But for Emma, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she got to see Kaiser. What mattered was that she had survived. What mattered was that she had found a friend who would risk everything to save her, and that she could spend time with that friend, and that the bond they had forged in those terrible moments beneath the ice would never be broken. One afternoon, as Emma sat in the police station's training yard, watching Kaiser practice his obedience exercises, she turned to James and asked a question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Why did Kaiser save me?" she asked. "He didn't know me. He could have died trying to save me. Why did he do it?" James thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Kaiser was trained to save people," he said finally. "But more than that, he was trained to care, to put other people's lives before his own. It's not something you can teach a dog. It's something that has to be inside them already. And Kaiser has it in abundance. He's the bravest dog in the world, Emma said with absolute certainty. He is, James agreed. But you know what? You're pretty brave too. You survived something that most people wouldn't have survived. You fought to stay alive. You came back from the edge. That's brave. Emma considered this, watching Kaiser perform a perfect sit-stay command from across the yard. We're both brave, she said finally. Kaiser and me, we're brave together. And looking at the girl and the dog, at the bond that had been forged in tragedy and strengthened through time and attention and the kind of love that transcends all boundaries, James couldn't help but agree. They were brave together, and together they would face whatever came next.